Before the buildings, bitumen and crowds, our lands were looked after by traditional owners, people who embodied readiness in their awareness and connection to their environment. We have so much to learn from them. EMPA asks that you take a moment to think about the traditional owners and First Nations of the land you are on. Pay respect to them and thank them, their elders past, present and emerging, as we meet on their lands today. Let us always respect them, cherish them and listen to the land.
I'm Barbara Ryan, the Chair of EMPA, and thanks for spending your lunch hour with us, or if you're on the other side of the world, for going to sleep for this session. This webinar is another step in our efforts to share knowledge and lessons and also research in the emergency communication and community engagement space. Our guest today is Tim Graham from Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane. He's been studying bots and the manipulation of online networks for at least 5 years. And he's recently focused on disinformation and misinformation and bots and trolls. So Tim is part of a research team that's investigating the origins and sharing of fake news that emerged during the Australian bushfires. And they've added COVID-19 to the search. And today, Tim's going to share their results to give us some insights on how bots and trolls might influence your work. At the end of the session, we'll do a Q&A. And so if you have any questions, just jot them into the Q&A forum and I'll put them to Tim at the end. And you're also welcome to comment, chat and even share resources on this topic on the chat forum with others that are here today. So make sure your cup is topped up and your phone and email are turned off because you really don't want to miss one word of this one. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Barb. Thank you, and thank you to EMPA for putting all of this together. It's great to be here. So I suppose I might jump into the presentation if that suits, Barb.
Great, thanks.
Hopefully my screen is being shared there. Okay. Yeah, so thanks again for organising the webinar today. So I'm going to be talking about conspiracy theories and and disinformation, particularly during COVID-19, and looking at kind of a new cutting-edge area of work where we move from just an analysis of people or trolls or accounts or bots or whatever who are getting involved in spreading misinformation, but potentially also, coordinated or centrally orchestrated efforts. And I'll talk about this in a moment. So just quickly, I am, as Barb mentioned, I am part of the Digital Media Research Centre at QUT. So a lot of the work and the infrastructure that I use to do this kind of social media analysis is very generously provided through the DMRC. So I guess just a shout out to them to get in touch and to check out the website and the projects that are happening there. Lots of opportunities for collaboration, and they're a great bunch of folk working in this space. So yeah, I think it would be definitely good to get in touch with them. In terms of what I'm going to present on today, there's kind of 4 areas. The first is that I'm going to talk about briefly some of the opportunities and the challenges, the good and the bad, of investigating mis and disinformation during crisis and emergency events. I'm going to then look at the origins and early spread of conspiracy theories at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then moving into a bit of reporting of some exploratory work that we're doing at the moment, looking at detecting coordination. So seeing whether there's anyone or anything that might be behind, this kind of suspicious, inauthentic activity that seems to be cropping up so much, especially this year. And then at the end, I'll provide some kind of takeaways and conclusions from all of the above. So I guess going back to the beginning of this year, many of you may remember the sheer amount of misinformation and maliciously spread misinformation or disinformation that was going around during the 2019 and 20 bushfires. So even though this emergency created all sorts of material and logistic problems for individuals and communities, we also had an explosion of fake news and kind of what we might describe as an information disorder, or an infodemic, as it's being described these days, where bots and trolls and fringe kind of political groups were getting a lot of limelight and spreading a lot of rumours, hoaxes and misinformation about the causes of the fires, about where they were, the scope and the scale of them, and where they were spreading, and so on. So this research that I'm working on at the moment, I suppose it comes out of a fairly heavy negative period, particularly in Australia, as we was kind of forced onto the global disinformation space, with individuals and groups potentially spreading false information about climate change not being the cause of the fires, and arson being the cause, which is, I think, really in some ways set us back months or even years, not only in terms of addressing how bushfires themselves and the material reality of them, but also addressing the flood of misinformation and inauthentic behaviour that shapes the public discussion about it. And then moving on to the last few months, we've unfortunately kind of just come out of the bushfire emergency, and then found ourselves headlong into the COVID-19 pandemic. And recently, I mean, it's all over the news, but it really grew massively from late January into February, and then where we are at the moment is in a situation where conspiracy theories, hoaxes, such as Bill Gates having engineered the virus or profiting from the spread of the virus, through to 5G internet causing the virus, through to hoaxes and conspiracies about whether China bioengineered the virus as a weapon, and dozens or perhaps even hundreds of hoaxes and misinformation and malinformation that are going around at the moment. And this is not isolated to the online environment. So we see that there's been, in Australia even, there's been protests that involve people invoking these kinds of conspiracy theories and trying to advocate and lobby for the government to do something about this. And so, yeah, what happens online definitely doesn't stay online. And the infodemic, which is what the World Health Organization has been calling it, is more or less out of control now. So we have all of these conspiracy theories and misinformed people who are, unwittingly spreading fake news and false information, right through to what might be termed as malicious actors who are spreading it on purpose and trying to do damage to disinform society. So, I mean, this really provides a lot of motivation and context, to what I've been doing. And this is just this year alone. I guess it's worthwhile just quickly working through some of the science behind what we do and how we do this kind of analysis. And I suppose not everyone is aware about how you would go about collecting data from social media. So if you're interested to undertake this kind of analysis, or you just want to collect some data to do your own research, then you have to get it from somewhere. And at the moment, the official way to collect data, and this is the way that we do it at the DMRC, is through the platform application programming interfaces. So they're called APIs. They're basically a big data gateway, and you ask Twitter to send you, a bunch of tweets essentially that contain certain keywords. So during January, I was searching for keywords around particular hashtags such as arson emergency or Australia fires and things like that, and then it gives you back the data that you request. It'll give you back tweets that contain those key terms. And the object of this analysis, the objective is generally to take the data and then convert it into something that's usable and going to provide insights. So here, for example, I've got an example of a network, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on. And this network has been generated by taking the data that's provided by Twitter. In this case, it's tweets about COVID-19, and then organizing that in a way that brings to bear the kind of relationships and patterns that are in the data. So who's interacting with who, and in what ways. So, you know, if you're interested to get involved in this, or you're already doing social media analysis and you want to look for other ways to analyze the data, there's a variety of different approaches. I tend to take a more computational approach, using quantitative statistical analysis, but there's a lot of different methods available, and I guess if anyone's interested, then I'd be happy to discuss that, you know, at the end of the presentation, or get in touch with me. But I guess the downside to doing this kind of analysis is that by detecting it and finding it and then reporting on it, either, you know, through academic journals or through news media, it can actually become a kind of self-serving prophecy. And I don't think I've ever really, I haven't talked about this publicly before, and partly because I've just been so busy, you know, this year. But after January, after the arson emergency kind of debacle occurred, and some of the work that I was doing gained, you know, national and global attention, because people were so concerned that there were these what appeared to be, you know, coordinated bot and troll networks who were pushing climate change denialism and pushing these kinds of narratives and conspiracy theories. But I suppose it, you know, before I go on and talk about all of the benefits and all of the different methods and findings and results that are coming out of this work, I think it's also worth mentioning, you know, some of the caution that I think needs to be taken when doing this research, particularly when lives hang in the balance for emergencies such as the bushfires and for COVID-19. And in this graph, you can see this is the amount of activity, or the count of tweets that contained the hashtag #ArsonEmergency from early January through to about January 9. And you can see that there's this massive spike where suddenly there's a lot of activity on Twitter about this hashtag. And actually, there's a little bump just before the huge spike. And this is when I was discovering that there was some kind of, you know, disinformation campaign going on. People trying to push this hashtag as an alternative narrative to climate emergency, which was the hashtag that was trending at the time. But in doing so, it kind of brought to attention and became a beacon for anyone and everyone to jump on board and weigh in on the conversation. And this unfortunately included, you know, individuals or trolls or bots or whatever they were who weren't aware of this arson emergency hashtag and hadn't found their community to kind of spread this kind of misinformation, suddenly realizing, oh, hey, this is interesting. Yeah, that's true, actually. It's not climate change. And so they kind of joined the conversation, and not in a good way. So I guess I kind of want to make a confession in some ways about the care that needs to be taken in doing this work, and the close relationship that's required with news media in order to ensure that it doesn't simply throw wood on the fire, so to speak, and perhaps, you know, cause quite a lot of harm, or some harm, as well as the good that it does in bringing it into the light. But one of the key questions that's come out of the research I've been doing, particularly in the last 6 months with these two major emergency situations, I get asked a lot by other researchers, by security agencies and so on, and news media as well, whether what we're seeing is, you know, a bunch of armchair kind of pundits, you know, kind of the Uncle Arthurs of the world, sitting there, you know, at the computers, looking up conspiracy theories and engaging with movements like QAnon and things like that, conspiracy movements, individually or maybe in small groups or small forums. Or at the other end of the scale, is there any evidence that there are centrally coordinated misinformation campaigns that are kind of leveraging and exploiting these emergencies because they're strategic in some way? And I guess the prototypical example of this is Russian disinformation that has been charted and especially magnified in the last half of a decade, particularly around the 2016 US election, where we do have strong evidence, irrefutable evidence really, to show that Russia and other states as well, and other actors as well, but Russia in particularly, have been leading orchestrated disinformation campaigns that include thousands of paid trolls that work in agencies such as the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. And so this would represent something that's qualitatively different from, your armchair pundit, Uncle Arthur type individual sitting in an armchair. This is something else entirely. And of course, there's a kind of there's a bit of messiness between it, because the Uncle Arthurs might be whipped up by the by the coordinated campaigners, and the coordinated campaigners might be shaped by what the Uncle Arthurs of the world are interested in. With all due respect to people who are actually called Uncle Arthur, I guess I just use that as a kind of bit of terminology. So a question is that hasn't really been addressed at the moment is, where did all of this misinformation and disinformation come from that we're experiencing right now and over the last 2 months in particular around COVID-19? Because it didn't come from, it had to spring from somewhere. It had to start at some point, because the pandemic wasn't always a pandemic, and COVID-19 was not always a virus that was existing. But now we see mainstream media, and this is from late April, an article in The Australian, picking up on some of these conspiracy theories and these hoaxes and rumors, touting them as journalism. We see here is an example of an article that suggests that China may have, or a lab in Wuhan in China may have been the source of the infection. And this leads into and plays into a narrative that perhaps China had engineered the COVID-19, the coronavirus, as a weapon, and it has somehow escaped, whether accidentally or on purpose. And newspapers such as The Australian are reporting on this, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why it becomes so big and moves from the fringe. So the approach that we've taken in analysing this was to basically collect a huge volume of coronavirus-related tweets from late January. This was when this was prior to it being labelled as a pandemic, but it was really as the virus had started to gain attention in the media. And what we were looking to do was to really understand was there any coordinated amplification of particular conspiracy theories? There were 6 major ones, and I'll talk about these in a moment. But in particular, we were interested in this China bioweapon conspiracy that had become so popular that now even Donald Trump, the President of the United States of America, is talking about it in press conferences. I mean, it's hard to believe, but it started out small and somehow or another made it onto the biggest stage in the world. The question is, how did that happen? And what we look at here is constructing networks from the data that let us look at or find evidence of coordination between Twitter accounts, and in particular, efforts to amplify particular tweets and particular messages by retweeting them very close, within the same minute and frequently. So, if 2 lone conspiracy theorists are sitting, in their armchairs, and they both happen to retweet a conspiracy theory, at the same time, I mean, that's kind of normal, and we would expect that kind of behavior. But if, a whole pile of accounts are all retweeting the same kinds of, or the exact same tweet, all within the same minute, basically the same window of time repeatedly, then we start to see that there may be kind of a coordinated efforts to amplify this, to kind of astroturf and show false support for these kinds of ideas, in the hope that they will eventually get enough oxygen that they can kind of take off and become self-serving prophecies. And of course, the third diagram here is a question of, well, if we do find centrally coordinated retweeters, then is there someone or something that's kind of centrally managing them? Are they part of a conspiracy group such as QAnon, or are they sponsored paid trolls from a Kremlin-linked organization such as the Internet Research Agency? We don't know. And so this is what this analysis is really trying to uncover. So as I mentioned, we looked at 6 conspiracy theories. This is, again, in late January this year, trying to look at the origins and how they spread. The 2 biggest ones that we found was the Bill Gates sponsoring the coronavirus conspiracy, and then the bioweapon one. So we focused our analysis mostly on the China bioweapon conspiracy. And what we found was that there was quite a lot of co-retweeting activity, more than 11,000 instances of accounts who were frequently retweeting the same kinds of China bioweapon narratives and tweets, trying to get them to go viral, essentially. So what you can see in this diagram is that it's a network of the top 10 clusters of accounts who were pushing this and co-retweeting this together. So these are coordinated accounts who are trying to push the China bioweapon conspiracy in late January. I've labeled each of these clusters of accounts. Some of them are connected, you can't really see it, but it's removed all of the other nodes in the network, and it's just focusing on these really high frequency, really coordinated accounts. And I mean, one of the key takeaways, and this was somewhat surprising in some ways, but in other ways it kind of made sense to us as well, was that about half of these accounts and half of the communities, the top communities pushing this, they identified as pro-Trump, kind of QAnon, which is a formal conspiracy theory group, quite a large one on the internet at the moment, really working together and as a kind of coordinated movement to try and push these tweets. And then of course we find other other kinds of communities that form, but really the majority of these are, and again, this is not to take to take my own political stance, but these accounts identify as conservative, right-wing, populist actors. This is what they write on their own profiles. That's how they identify, and they were for the large part responsible for pushing this out into the world in late January. So on the left, you can see a Twitter profile of a kind of a typical pro-MAGA QAnon account. MAGA, of course, is the Make America Great again slogan that Donald Trump used in his 2016 presidential election campaign. And these kinds of accounts are a dime a dozen on social media, but they have this kind of link with not only with Donald Trump but also with QAnon. So they really do believe in these theories. They think that they're true, and they think that there is that Donald Trump is fighting the good fight for them in various different ways. But we also see, and this is more alarming, I think, we see that there are US Congress people who are tweeting about this kind of conspiracy, and it's being, so for example here, the US Senator Jim Banks, a Republican, and these pro-MAGA QAnon accounts are basically jumping on and just coordinatedly amplifying this. It's kind of a sign, well, if Jim Banks is saying it's true, then it must be true. And it gives so much oxygen to these theories and these narratives. And that really was quite a concerning finding for us in this. The key takeaways that we have from this analysis of the early magnification of the China bioweapon conspiracy is that it was probably viewed, just in terms of sheer impressions on screens, we estimate that it was probably viewed about 1.6 million times. That's the reach of all of this coordinated activity. And in some ways, we don't know for sure whether or to what extent this was responsible for making this such a global, such a global issue that was covered by mainstream media and talked about by by elected political officials, including the president. But we do think that there's definitely going to be a link between what happened in late January and what we're experiencing now. The consequences of which, are potentially extremely dire, but they're not dire for those who were behind it. So if there are, and we're still looking into this, but if there are orchestrated campaigners who are working together to try and push this, or to whip up the pro-MAGA QAnon communities on Twitter and other platforms, then it was successful for them. That's a job well done. It's essentially the payday for disinformers, but for democracy and for the effective reactions by the government and by health makers and policymakers. This is a major problem. I'm conscious of time, but I wanted to also talk fairly briefly about some work in progress. So I haven't discussed this yet. It's not part of any publications, but this is really looking at coordinated bot networks during COVID-19. So not just trolls, not just Uncle Arthur's working together or becoming useful idiots for the Kremlin disinformation operations, but bots, computer-controlled accounts that are pushing whatever on social media. So very briefly, we used a similar methodology to what I've just discussed previously. We're tracking hashtags that are much broader than conspiracy theories. We're looking at the overarching conversation about the coronavirus. And we were looking at it more recently, so at the beginning of March, for about 10 days. And we collected quite a lot of data. So in this analysis, we focus on 25 million retweets of about 3 million tweets. So it's quite a lot of data. And we modify this co-retweet method. We modify the method that we used previously to construct networks where each of the nodes are accounts who have both retweeted the same tweet within like 0 or 1 seconds of each other repeatedly. So humans can't act that fast. And if they do, they're only going to do it maybe once or twice, but not many times over and over. So what this method lets us to do, and this is kind of a bleeding edge analysis, we're just running it at the moment and looking at what the results are. This provides an alternative way to detect bots in networks. So rather than using machine learning models like Tweetbot or Not2 or Botometer or other models like that, we're specifically looking for really, really, really super fast coordination in social media networks. And then we're identifying which accounts kind of fit that profile. And we can only surmise that because they are retweeting the exact same content, basically at exactly the same time, frequently, then there's no possible way that they're regular human beings. So here's an example of what we find, and I'm just going to move through this, fairly briefly. But this is a co-retweet network. We call it a co-retweet bot network because the accounts are linked together in the network if they've both retweeted the same tweet at least twice within 1 second of each other. So super fast retweeting that it couldn't really be happening by chance. And we ran some of the standard bot detection algorithms. We ran Tweetbot or Not2. I used that previously for the arson emergency work, and others have used it in other research as well. And it does a pretty good job of picking up the bot network. So you can see the red nodes are accounts that have been classified as bots by the machine learning approach, but it's missing a lot as well. And it really missed a lot of bots who form this massive, big cluster in the middle, bots that are just pushing COVID-19 related content for various different reasons. And what we find is that this big cluster, so cluster 1 in the middle, is super interesting, and we learn a lot from analysing the accounts in here. You can see, here's an example of 2, and this is in Turkish, so I have to translate it to see what it is, but you can see that they're exactly the same tweets. They're posted, more or less at exactly the same time, and in the same order, but they come from different accounts. And what we found in this cluster was that there were, kind of coordinated bot networks that were magnifying already existing political tensions in Turkey. And they were just sowing confusion and anxiety about the spread and its effective response from government. So whilst the Turkish government was trying to effectively respond to the spread of the coronavirus, they also had to put up with, and maybe they don't even know about this yet, but with these kinds of bots who sometimes tweet about regular things, maybe platitudes and daily prayers and things for about Islam, and sometimes even puppy videos and things like that. But the rest of the time they're pushing kind of negative content about the coronavirus and about the government's response to it. So I guess the takeaway from that is that we learn a lot from these new methods, but it remains to be seen, who might be behind these kinds of campaigns, if anyone, and why they would be doing it. It's still a bit of a puzzle for us. So some of the key takeaways so far, as I mentioned before, what we've found is that there's a kind of a parallel between the spread, and it spreads in a kind of viral way, but the spread of this infodemic, so all of this misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, which is real news stories, but they might have a particular bent. So they might be like, pictures of deceased people lying in the street and kind of things like that. Yes, it might be real news, that might be the case, but they're just pushing that to try and make try and bias the public perspective of what's actually going on. And we see that there is a parallel between the emergence of these conspiracy theories and other hoaxes in the outbreak since mid-January, and it kind of correlates with the amount of coordinated amplification that we're seeing through our analysis. What we really are concerned about here is the relationship between conspiracy theories and the media. So one of the issues is that often the individuals or the orchestrated campaigns who are pushing this kind of content, conspiracy theories, hoaxes, and things like that, they may remain on the fringe, and based on the evidence, they're kind of on the right-wing fringe of social media. But they would otherwise stay there, and you would they would shout into the forest, but they wouldn't really get much attention, and no one would really hear them. The problem is when elected politicians and celebrities, such as Woody Harrelson, who tweeted about the 5G conspiracy, or even yesterday, Bryan Adams, the singer-songwriter, was tweeting about, made a very offensive and racist tweet about China and the origin of the virus. But also news media, mainstream news media. They have such a key role to play in taking what would otherwise remain on the fringe and not really make that much of an effort, not really make its way into the homes of everyday citizens, to something that's suddenly on the TV screens and in front of the eyeballs on the computer screens of millions and millions, or billions of people around the world. And that's what happens once someone like Donald Trump starts to pick up on it. So what we learn is from this analysis is really that the important and critical role that media, celebrities and politicians play in not spreading this any further and not taking it from the conspiratorial fringe through to the mainstream. In many ways, this is kind of the clincher. These are super spreaders of these kinds of things. And whilst the government may be trying to effectively combat the virus, or combat and counter and remedy the damage done by bushfires and so on, I think that there really is a mandate to address this as well. And finally, the further outlook, looking ahead, into the horizon, I think there's some critical questions that need to be made around what we actually do to regulate this, how we can actually address and combat it. What can people working on the ground do? What can service people do? Academics, politicians, and it's a complex scenario at the moment. Simply taking down the content or putting warning signs up doesn't seem to be enough. I think that what we really need to do at the moment is think about how we can do education and look into new forms of inoculating people against misinformation and disinformation, to be able to know, to have the tools and the knowledge to be able to know when they're being confronted by this kind of content, some of the telltale signs that a piece of content might not be from a legitimate actor or may not be scientifically based, and so on. So I mean, there's a major need at the moment for for heads to come together and be able to come up with some kind of plan, particularly in Australia, for our in some ways unique issue with large scale bushfires if they happen again during the next summer. But I will make a note that even though platforms such as Twitter in particular do provide access to data, and that's wonderful, and Facebook have been coming forward more by providing services such as CrowdTangle to enable researchers and journalists to look at this, there really is a substantial need for more access to data. So lobbying for that is probably one of the best things we can do at the moment. Otherwise, we're running blind, and we just can't keep, we can't have our radar on this kind of stuff if we don't have access to the data. And likewise, national research infrastructure. So I'm very fortunate to be able to benefit from the Digital Media Research Centre at QUT. But for many individuals and organisations, getting access to infrastructure to crunch the numbers, to be able to get the insights, I think that's probably that's a big one at the moment, and something that I think we need to have a national discussion about. And just before I conclude here, I just want to make a few acknowledgements. So my collaborators, Axel Bruns, Tobias Keller, Dan Angus, and Rio Zhu. So these are the collaborators that I'm working with in the Digital Media Research Centre, particularly on this work. So a shout out to them. All of what I've presented on is a team effort. So thank you to those to my comrades there. And so that concludes my presentation, Barb.
There was a question that dealt with this cycle from bots through to the mainstream media, which I think you answered. But I wonder, is that a vicious cycle? Does that keep going, or does it tend to die down once mainstream media has had its run?
I think it's a bit of both, Barb. I would say that, so if we focus on bots and trolls, like paid accounts who look like a regular person, but they're actually, someone sitting at a computer in a troll farm somewhere, prototypical kind of troll, paid troll. I think that they become super active during crisis events and emergencies. They jump onto this. It's really good, and that's always been the case. For hundreds of years, more or less. One might even say thousands of years. Wars are great times for disinformation and epidemics. It's the same case. I lost my train of thought.
We were asking about whether it keeps going as a cycle, whether it goes back from mainstream media back to bots and then back to mainstream media. Did you see any of that in your data?
Yes. So the vicious cycle, this is in many ways the vicious cycle. I love that term because it is a vicious cycle. That's what's to blame for why we end up in a situation like we do, with people with, picketing government and places like that, and Donald Trump getting up and talking about conspiracy theories and things like that. The reason for that is this kind of two-way recursive cycle between fringe actors on social media, and that includes bots and trolls, through to mainstream media. And again, the payday for disinformers is when the media picks up on something in a big way. You know, they're always looking for and they're co-opting and cultivating existing communities. And, you know, I don't want to be an apologist, and I don't want to make this a kind of political debate or anything like that. But, you know, what we've seen is that you do have what appear to be genuinely, you know, organic, conservative individuals on social media, as well as kind of far left individuals as well, who, and again, I'm not apologizing for anyone or trying to make a political statement here, but both sides are targeted by bots and trolls, by disinformers, because they're so good that they become, and this is not my term, but they become useful idiots in propagating the narratives that the disinformers want. So when they infiltrate these groups and whip them up and try and get them to push something, and then suddenly a celebrity weighs in, or you know, like Woody Harrelson does, or Wiz Khalifa weighed in on the 5G conspiracy, or worse still, a politician, or the Australian newspaper, or the Sydney Morning Herald. And the Sydney Morning Herald did that during before the arson emergency, before the bushfires began. It was talking about arson as the cause of the fires. I mean, that's when you really have, you know, a vicious cycle on your hands that's going to go on for years, basically. And that's what keeps it alive, and kind of alive and maybe dormant, but then at any moment it could spark up again.
Yeah. Okay. And do you find that social media, perhaps through trolls, launches the misleading, which is then picked up by cash poor mainstream media? I'm sorry, we've already dealt with that question. Can bots be hidden by changing their posting patterns to be more human? So if that's the case, can we identify them in some other way?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, because one of the issues with the current state-of-the-art tools for detecting bots, whether they're the ones that we use in research or the ones that the platforms use, is that they play a cat and mouse game where they'll train, for the most part, they train, you know, machine learning models on known bots and troll activity. And they say, okay, here's what one looks like. So when a new one comes along, we can say with what probability is it a bot or not. But then, of course, the bots, the people who design bots and the people who run these campaigns just say, okay, just like you said, Barb, just change what you're doing. Don't post with so much regularity. And you know, so for example, they'll add a bit of randomness in. Rather than posting once every hour, they'll randomly post in the hour, or they'll pretend to have a diurnal activity frequency where they'll kind of go to sleep during the night for about 8 hours and not post very much, and that throws these models off. But then the models catch up and they say, hey, okay, now the bots are programmed to be diurnal. They're programmed to have some kind of randomness to them, and so it's this constant game of whack-a-mole which causes problems. But what I've looked at today, and this is why we're really focusing on the notion of coordination, is it's much harder to hide coordinated activity. And I think in many ways, it's not just looking at individual accounts that's going to get to the truth of the matter. Okay, is this a bot? You know, look at this profile. Is this a bot or not? It's looking at a group working together. And if enough of them are behaving in the same way, even though you may not be able to do very well with accurately detecting one, when they're working together and when you can see that coordination and find those patterns, I think that's when you can really make some progress. And that's what we're doing at the moment. We're just exploring those kinds of methods.
And do you think it would be possible to have sort of a parallel Twitterverse where emergency agencies can use that to get out legitimate messages that would earn its stripes in terms of trust and be impervious to bots and trolls? Is that a scenario we could even think about?
Well, that would be lovely, and that would be ideal in many ways. But I guess there's two problems. The first is how you would attract people to use the platforms, and so I guess going more broadly into like the industry of social media, getting that initial surge of activity is crucial in order to ensure that a platform gets enough population to take off. And you know, everyone who's anyone who's an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley is trying to figure out how to do that. Attracting people organically is really difficult, and there's a huge mountain of failed social media platform ideas out there, and then a small amount that actually succeeded. It's not to say that it's not a good idea; it's a very good idea. But I guess the question would be, how do you engage people and get them to use the platform in the first instance, unless you're forcing them to. And then keeping malicious actors out is not going to be a problem if you've only got 100 subscribers or 1,000 or 10,000, but potentially. But once you start to get into, once you get a decent kind of population going within any platform, you basically become a target for disinformation, and you'll get enough people that some of them are spreading fake news, and they're going, hey, I think I'm getting coronavirus off these 5G towers. Don't you think that's real? And then you're like, oh, okay, now we've just got to do what Twitter does. So, I don't mean to kind of throw water on what is otherwise an excellent idea. And there would be ways to maybe leverage social media platforms to get communication out. But yeah, in terms of a standalone Shangri-La for emergency communication, there may be a few challenges.
Okay. And just really quickly, how much do you think Google and Facebook contribute to the distribution of adverts, that giving you posts of similar topics that you search for? So like you search for a bike and you get similar posts in your feeds. How much does that contribute to fake news?
Wow, that's a really good question. It's a pity that my colleague, Professor Axel Bruns, is not here to talk about this, because he wrote a book recently about, it's called A Filter Bubble's Real. And he talks about this idea of the filter bubble that's been going around for maybe half a decade or a decade now. And it's this idea that because we get served up individualized recommendations for ads and for products and for content and people to follow and such, based on who we already are and what we already like, it may lock us into these sort of microcosms or bubbles of activity that magnify political partisanship, or kind of make us more extreme versions of ourselves in some ways. And I mean, I'm not going to say that the jury is out on there, because, and to paraphrase the finding of Axel's book is that he thinks that the filter bubbles aren't real, and that they don't play that much of a role in, turning armchair pundits into full-blown conspiracy theorists. I just don't think that the idea that serving up individualized ads and recommendations causes that to happen is not tenable, in his analysis. But I mean, I do think that there is a key role to play, and we still have a lot of work to do to get to the bottom of kind of trigger points for individuals where they might be on the fringe for a little bit, and then suddenly they'll see something that meshes with their, motivated reasoning is the term used in kind of social psychology, that they have a prior beliefs that provide a kind of cognitive motivation to believe this. It's like, yeah, you know what? China is to blame, and maybe they did do it. And it's that trigger point that I think is really problematic for hyper individualized content and ads. So I mean, that probably is a bit of overkill for that question, but somewhere between Axel and the question raised by this person, I think we have the answer there.
Okay. And both Axel and Tim are on Twitter. So if you search Axel Bruns and Timothy J. Graham, I think it is, Tim?
Yep, Timothy.
Yep. And their research will be promoted via Twitter once it's published. We're just about out of time, so please thank Tim for his quite breathtaking presentation and the wider research project. If you're staying to take part in the networking after the session, the HPE team will have emailed you the meeting link, but you can also use the meeting ID that's on the slide that you should be able to see right now after we finish here. We hope today was worth the investment of time over this lunch hour. If you found it valuable, then please have a look at our conference, which starts in 18 days, 22 hours and 13 minutes. It goes over 4 days from 11:30 to 1:30 p.m. Brisbane time, and you can find more details on our website at empa.org.au. So thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you all at the conference. Thank you, Tim.
And yeah, thanks, Barb, and thank you, EMPA. Yeah, it was great to be here today. So yeah, appreciate the invitation. Thank you.